This has been fascinating. Thank you, Lulu. There's so many things that these guys have been talking about. That obviously education is just one of the biggest topics. What I find fascinating at the moment is all the big institutions seem to be being challenged. And we're having crises in them all, whether it's banking, politics, education. We've got problems with them. And these institutions need to be fundamentally changed. The legal system. I've got a thought. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could have a personalised legal system? Each of us has the legal system that works for us, rather than a generic one that works for everybody. I don't know how that would work, but if we're moving towards personalisation, we're seeing politics as being personalised. Is it Sweden that's starting to allow people to vote on every issue? Yeah. Banking is being personalised. You had Mondo, amazing guys there, are changing, disrupting banking. Politics, we know, is being disrupted. But education has been the same for about 2,000 years. And essentially it works like this. I know something that you don't, so I'm going to talk at you, and magic happens, and you know it. That's how it works, isn't it? That's how it's worked for about 2,000 years. There have been some real amazing innovations in it, so rather than talking, someone's written it down so they can duplicate it. And then the printing press came along, and that made the process even faster. Then the internet came along, so you could distribute the words even quicker, or even video. You can have the person speaking to the camera, hello in internet land, so you can distribute it even further. But nothing's actually changed. We haven't got better at learning or better at teaching in 2,000 years. And one of the big issues we've got is because education works off essentially we're fighting entropy. So there's a Hermann Ebbinghaus, famously in the 1890s, identified what they call the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So after someone presents something to you, remember 100% of it, let's say. And after about 20 minutes, that's dropped to about 60%. And after a month, it's down to 20%. And after a year, you've pretty much forgotten it all. And so that's what the education system fights. So what they do is they keep on repeating things over a period of time, trying to prevent you from getting. But isn't it bizarre? We spend 2, 3, 4, 5 years at GCSE, A-level, degree, PhD, learning, in inverted commas, and then the week before the exam, we cram. Why? If we've learnt it, why do we need to cram? What are we doing with the 2, 3, 4, 5 years of our lives prior to the exam? And let's forget the fact that exams are just what's the point of exams? Who are we testing? The student or the teacher? I mean, the whole system is just bizarre. So how are we going to make it fit for purpose? The pressures on education in the 21st century are totally different from the last 2,000 years. The pace of change, as we've seen, is such that the people who are growing up in an education system and then have been trained to teach it already don't know what's happening out in the world. The advances in science, how can we teach science if science is moving so quickly that things that we thought we knew have changed? And what are we educating people for? So the most watched TED video of all time, I'm sure everybody in the room probably has seen it, is Sir Ken Robinson's talk about education and creativity. Creativity is a word that lots of people use without really understanding what we're talking about. Because creativity isn't a thing. There are lots of different approaches to creativity and lots of different tools and techniques to work on those different problems. So for example, a puzzle where you have a defined outcome, you work in a different way to a problem. And there are simple puzzles. So a simple puzzle, for example, a puzzle. If you had 2 people to do a puzzle, assuming they've both got the same abilities, the most you can get from it is halving the time, but you've doubled the resource. So timesheets, figuring out how to get there. These are all simple puzzles that lots of businesses, activities do every day. And then you get complex puzzles. So a complex puzzle would be building a house. Architects design it, we know what it should look like. But the more people you put in to build it, you get exponential speed and efficiencies. Yeah. So my favorite example is an IKEA flat pack. Yeah? Do it on your own, it'll take you about 6 hours. 2 people take you 5 minutes because you can hold and someone adds the piece. Yeah? So adding 2 people produces exponential benefits. Those are creative activities. You are creating something. But then you come to problems. And this is where the problem resides, because there are different types of problem. Broadly speaking, there are 2. There are tame problems, and tame problems are one with a stable problem statement. And this is what business is like. We solve this problem. It's what schools and education like. Here's a problem, can you solve it? As we train people in tame problem solving. So you get the water flow, you know, the waterfall project management type thing. What's the nature of the problem? Come up with a range of solutions, hone it, implement it. Yeah, that's how businesses work. There's another type of creativity called wicked problems. And wicked problems are fun. Wicked problems are ones which don't have a stable problem statement. Everyone disagrees on what the nature of the problem is. You only know what the nature of the problem is after you've come up with a solution. Yeah? Is everyone familiar with those? And wicked problems are the sort of things that people are talking about here. You can't think your way to a wicked problem solution. They just emerge out of conversations and being connected into society. So if I was to say, what's the problem with knife crime, for example? You could say it's educational, dietary, social, and you could keep on going. Environmental. Let's say it's educational. As soon as you say it's an educational problem, the solution is, by definition, going to be an educational solution. But that's not going to solve knife crime. So the way that we think, the way that we approach these problems is going to be very different. And the types of big problems that we face today are not tame problems. The big issues on the board, you know, on the plate of the boards and in a fast-moving, disruptive world are wicked problems. So education is becoming increasingly important. So how are we going to change it? Well, rather than putting stuff into people's short-term memory, which is the way that the traditional education works, we're developing a new approach. We've been working with academics at Oxford University and the University of Surrey to develop and validate a new learning methodology which embeds information in the long-term memory. So we can deliver the same learning outcomes in an hour as 23 hours of classroom-based learning. And we're using digital format so we can scale it. Because what teachers are really good at is working with individuals. What they're not very good at, and what people aren't very good at, is replicating things. What computers in the digital world is really good at is scaling and replicating and doing boring, mundane tasks like teaching. So we're going to see, well, people are starting to talk about the flipped classroom. Is that something I'm not allowed to say?
I think there's probably a fire alarm.
Fire alarm. Shall I plough on through, or I want to crack on? So that's what Download does. I'm going to talk a bit more about it in a moment, but I don't want to pitch Download to you. If anyone's interested, I can talk about it for hours. But I thought, as a group of sort of creative people who are probably interested in the startup scene, is how do you get to, and sort of how I got here, and sort of tying into some of the themes that the other guys have been talking about. So I started off in advertising land at Saatchi & Saatchi Bakes and 141. I was the world's worst account man in that my relationship with time is kind of loose. I think it was a problem because I grew up, my dad was in the military, and I moved schools. And so I only ever learnt 11 months of the year. And I know that sounds bizarre, but because you all know it. You all know the 12 months of the year, and you can recite them, so you know where you are in the year. But I moved schools, and I hadn't been taught it at one school, and they'd already taught it at the other, so I never got taught, never learnt the 12 months of the year. So I've got this weird relationship with time, which is not good if you're meant to be project managing stuff. So I loved the creative environment, but it wasn't really, it wasn't going to be my career. So I was in there for quite a while, into my early 30s, and then I hooked up with an ex-colleague of mine, and we started working. We'd worked together at Saatchi's, and he had worked with Desmond Morris, who some of you may know as the zoologist. He was one of the first people to start studying humans as animals. And he wrote a book called The Naked Ape, which he thought would only be, about 6 people would read, including his mother. But the Catholic Church got hold of it and burnt it, which seems crazy. I mean, I'm saying this now and you're going, oh, but this wasn't that long ago. But this is how quickly thinking has changed. Because what he suggested was that we weren't fallen angels, but risen apes. And this was such a radical idea that the book had to be burned. I said, were you upset by this? He said, God, no. £1 a copy, they could burn as many as they liked. So he earned about 16 million, which in the 60s was quite a lot of money. So he bought the island next to Marlon Brando's, and then he got bored. So he started funding all the projects that he wouldn't get funding for from the normal channels. And then he'd write them up or make a TV program about them. And then he'd make more money, and then he'd try and spend that. He doesn't think he's done any work since 1969. He's just been playing. Endlessly fascinating man. He was also the president of the Institute of Contemporary Art. He's a significant artist in his own right. Just fascinating. So we work with him on things like looking at male and female grooming behaviours for Gillette and communication skill. What's communication about for BT? Different social strategies that men and women employ. And we combined it with improvisational theatre. So how do a group of people take to the stage and create something out of nothing that an audience is willing to pay? Or the commercial term for that is marketing. And we do things like we take the target audience segmentation data and turn it into a character. We take the brand personality, because we anthropomorphise brands, don't we? We turn them into characters and we give them human attributes. Well, go and have that relationship. And he suddenly realised that innovative, dynamic and trustworthy, the brand personality, you look like an idiot. And even if you can do it, and you look like an idiot, it's really difficult for a copywriter or an art director to turn it into a commercial. It just doesn't work. So you find words that work and behaviours that work. So we got involved in innovation and culture change and branding, all sorts of interesting things. I got to work with fascinating people, including poker players who work with boards on risk assessment and decision making, Tai Chi masters, horse whisperers, artists, poets going into businesses and hearing the language that's being used and playing it back to the business so they can hear what they're saying, because often we can't hear ourselves. And then a couple of years ago, I realised that clients are really tedious. And we were working with clients, and the ideas that we were thinking about and developing weren't going anywhere. So we decided to turn our tools on ourselves. And I gave myself permission to do the weird projects and things that sit at the back of your mind that you never really act on. So I started doing Pachakacha Night. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's getting interesting, creative, talented people to share their stories in 20 images, each image shown for 20 seconds. And the people who are brilliant at it are creative people, and the people who suck at it are businessmen and people who do Toastmasters and things like that. And we had fabulous people, sort of Brendan Kelly, who's one of our leading portrait artists, and the guys who did the boat project for the Olympiad, who created a boat out of stories with an Olympic bronze medalist, I think he was, and sailed it around the UK. And the log was a song rather than written down. It was just fabulous stuff. I set up a thing called the River of Lights, where we turned the River Wey in Guildford, I just live outside, on the winter solstice. We turned it into a river of lights with candles in oranges, hollowed out with tea lights in, floating down the river. And we had wassailing crowds and all sorts of things like that. I then got asked to do Bright Club, where we got university academics to do stand-up comedy based on their current research. I opened a coffee shop because my wife commutes up to London, and she wanted a coffee in the morning, so I opened a coffee shop. Everyone should have a coffee shop, I think. And I got to be at the school gates with my kids and suddenly realised that these extraordinarily talented women are trapped in the school environment. And I was one of the few dads. Over the last 6 to 8 years, that's changed, and the amount of men at the school gates has just gone up. It's still not huge, but I was one of the few men in the playground talking with... oh, sorry, I'll show you my coffee shop, actually. I've got a picture of it. That's my coffee shop. It's licensed, and we do pop-up restaurant nights. I want to do karaoke in it. Get people to come in the evening and do karaoke. It'll be quite fun. I'm going to do a photographic exhibition on the platform, which is coming up soon and stuff like that. And all of this was going on, and I got hooked into the University of Surrey with a business school. And I was thinking in this space, how do I get people to turn up a little bit earlier for their train? And I thought maybe we could do some seminars for people, corporates going up to work. And then I had back of my brain, I still remember this thing that I'd read in the Guardian newspaper about a new learning methodology up in the north of England by a guy called Dr. Paul Kelly. He's an anglicised Californian. And he had taken the work of a guy called Douglas Fields, who's a neuroscientist. And Fields had been looking at... One of the issues with education is it's been overrun by psychologists. Now, psychologists, a lot of what they do is really cool, but they often overstep their bounds of what they actually know. And so psychologists have looked at education, whereas neuroscientists go under the bonnet and look at how the engine actually works. So psychologists would say a car must have an animal spirit driving it, whereas a mechanic says what you do is you've got a piston there and that explodes and that spark goes off. And what he found is that to create a memory, there are certain triggers, and you have to trigger certain synapses to create neural connections, and there's a time code to it. So the way memories are formed, or one of the ways that's reliable and replicable, is through repetition, but the critical variable is the gap between the repetitions. So Paul phoned up Douglas and said, I'm an educationist, can I take your research? And they worked together to develop a new learning methodology. They took a group of students who weren't studying biology and gave them an hour of biology, covering one module, which they would normally cover in 2 terms. A year later, as those students were walking into school, he said, can you sit the exam and sit that part of the paper, versus students who'd been studying biology full time. And they did as well or better. No revision, no homework. So I thought maybe we could do a bit in the cafe, and then they get on the train, and bit by bit it became this digital thing. And we're talking with Professor Adcroft. He said, the problem I've got is we teach students one way up to A level, and then we say, forget that, we'll teach you a different way at university. And then once you've left, you forget that, and you have to learn a different way in the corporate world. Isn't this nuts? It's crazy how we change. So he wanted to look at what are the methodologies of the 21st century that actually work. He was also slightly distressed because he'd looked at what the grades were that students get who turn up to lectures versus those who don't. And there's no difference, which at £9,000 a year is a bit of a concern. So we ran a learning tournament where we compared different learning methodologies, and we put in a prototype of what would become Download. We, in terms of knowledge acquisition, so how much they learned, Download learners 20% more than traditional learners, 23% more than directed learners. These are students who were given the raw material and read them in their own time. And then this euphemistically called independent learners, this could only happen with students, were a group of students who didn't do any of the learning inputs but thought they should have done, so they turned up and did the exam. So they're like our control group. So this is sort of measuring latent knowledge. The topic was the advertising regulations that we got from the IPA, from the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. But not just that, when you adjusted and brought back to a baseline of learning acquisition, when you learned using Download, you were better able to apply it. And this is where creativity starts coming in. And again, for extension, so can you take that knowledge and extend it into a domain or an area that you haven't been taught? Again, Download significantly outperforms the other learning methodologies. So we're starting to work with organisations, and this is the way we think about it. So there are three key areas. The first is what we call cultural literacy. So cultural literacy is this idea that you can only learn a topic if you understand the language of it. I can't decode French because I don't know the French language. I can't decode chemistry because I can't speak chemistry. I can't decode Boots brand because I don't speak Boots brand. You have to learn the language of an organisation in order to be able to operate within it. So we're working with the likes of Crossrail, who are bringing together engineers from different construction companies, architects, builders. You've got all of the IT infrastructure, etc. So all these different people from different industries, sectors, trying to create something and giving them a common language and understanding how the business works. Core skills. So we're working with the police on stop and search with Surrey Police. How do you do a stop and search? So they need to know the law and how to apply it. There are 300,000 frontline policemen. The COP, the College of Police, can't make this up, have mandated an hour's e-learning and 2 days of workshop. That 2 days of workshop with 300,000 frontline policemen equates to over 2,000 years of training just for one bit of their job. And we can deliver the same learning outcomes, or expecting to, we're running the pilot at the moment, saving 2,000 years of, and if you think about this on a global level in terms of corporates. And then core knowledge. So we're working with people like the Construction Industry Training Board training scaffolders. So they have to know health and safety. And the way that they currently teach it is they're put in a classroom. These are people who never liked classrooms anyway. Put in a classroom and they learn it for a week, do an exam, then forget it. I'm going to end it there, I think, but the way that we think education, I don't think we're the only people doing this. I think there are lots of people finding new ways for education to work. And one of the barriers that we're facing is the existing infrastructure, so classrooms themselves, so the geography, as well as the embedded thinking of how education works. So one last thought. The way that we think about education is that you learn something and the day after you've forgotten a little bit, and that goes on. With download, the day after you have the least recall. Thereafter, your recall improves. And the reason for that is memory and learning is a chemical process. It's a bit like your muscles. You don't expect the day after going to the gym to be at your strongest, your weakest, and then the connections, the fibers regrow, the connections in your brain grow, and your memory improves. And I'll give that as an example just to show how our concept of education, of learning, needs to be flipped. I think I'll leave it there.